Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. We're currently on summer hiatus, but we wanted to pop in with a very special recording of an in-person event we hosted at the end of July at Annex Project in Calgary. We're releasing the episode early to our EVC donors as a way of saying thank you for your support. In the show, we cover some thoughts on the climate news of the summer, answer some live audience questions, and tease some potential future topics we hope to cover on EVC. We had a great time engaging with folks in person, so stay tuned for more information about future in-person programming. Until then, here's the show. Make it interactive. More interactive than one of our normal podcast webinars. So,
we're not asking to throw bottles of beer is too interactive.
Yeah, throwing bottles of beer might be too interactive. I hope you're all enjoying the beer here. It looks good. You can sit there, everyone out there, you can hear us okay? Yeah, the magic of amplified sound. Wonderful. So, first off, I want a big thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's great. As I said, it's our first ever in-person event. And, well, we're buoyed. We think that we could do more of these based on the turnout. And a big thank you to Emma Rose and Andrew Bullied. So Emma Rose is the GM here.
Thank you.
Right there. And Andrew Bullied, who is the founder and the chief of brewery operations here. So, brewery options. Yeah, I'll take some options on the brewery, please. So the way this came about, by the way, is we did if you recall, a crypto versus climate episode. And that we did what podcasters shouldn't do, and that's we drank and recorded at the same time. Sarah, what was the name of the beer that you put out for us?
I think it was Easy Answers. Is that right?
Something like that.
Easy Answers, produced by Annex Project. And we quite liked it. Yeah, we quite liked it. So we mentioned that on the pod. And then, of course, because integrity is of utmost importance to us, when we launched the pod and put it out there, Sarah promoted it on Twitter and said, and oh, by the way, we're not sponsored by Annex Project. Just want to be clear, we drank Easy Answers. We provided, hopefully, not easy answers, and we're not sponsored. And then Andrew responded by saying, hey, but if you're interested. Yeah. So now we're deeply in the back pocket of the Annex Project, full disclosure.
Dozens of dollars.
Deeply in the back pocket. Yeah. Yeah, depending on what we say about them, either our beers are free tonight or they're double charged. We'll see. So that's how we're here, and a big thank you to Andrew and to Emma. So we thought what we'd do tonight is we'd have a very quick conversation, and basically it's about what is moving the dial on energy and climate issues this summer. And then we would open it up to some of your questions. We've got a mic that can rove. And then we'd love to get from you some topic suggestions, because we've done 3 seasons now, and we're coming up to our 4th, and we're running out of material. Like, honestly, no. We have lots of things we could talk about, but we'd love to hear from you. What's top of mind for you? What do you think that we should cover in season 4? Sarah, David, does that look good?
That sounds great. I don't know if people know about Ed's improv history. I'm wondering if we're going to have an improv part of this live discussion. We didn't discuss that at all, but well, I never know what you're going to bring up.
Ed has a history both of improv and of having silent meditative sits for weeks. So it's like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Ed.
So should we have a show of hands? Do people want the improv Ed or the silent Ed?
Exactly,
I think we know which way it's going to go. Okay, well, let's assume it's the silent Ed for the next little bit. So why don't, David, you lead off?
Okay.
And you talk about, and I think, are you going to talk about Bjorn?
I will talk about, yes.
Okay, so I don't want to steal your thunder, so over to David about something turning the dial on climate energy this summer.
So, and then something we don't talk about. So I'm going to sort of talk about 2 things. First of all, something that really is topical. You know, you've all been hearing about heat waves. We've seen heat waves. There's no realistic question that these heat waves are partially driven by climate change and are going to get worse. I've been now spending a lot of time learning more about the epidemiology of how this kills people, reduces productivity, and so on. There's no question it really does. And there are now pretty good estimates of late in the century what the impacts would be, which are sort of order 5 million more people a year dying from heat impacts late century. And you can look at that as a big number or small number, but here's a quite surprising fact. A colleague of mine at Harvard, Jason Furman, sent an email saying that Bjorn Lomborg was pushing a paper that shows that so far in the first 2 decades of this century, 2000 to now, that the net effect of warming has been to reduce heat-related mortality, because heat-related mortality happens on both sides of an optimum. So for any city, you can look at how mortality varies with temperature, and there's a minimum. And when temperatures get very cold, mortality goes up. And when temperatures get high, it goes up, usually with a steeper curve. And then you can look at that and look at how the mortality's changed using those real data. And you can then look at how many people are dying because temperatures are non-optimal. That's the way we do the epidemiology. And so despite all the real things we've heard and real people who have died from heat, it is in fact true, even though Bjorn Lomborg says it, it is in fact true that so far in the first 20 years of the century globally, the net reduction in deaths from cold is bigger than the increase in deaths from hot. I'm not saying that's going to happen all century. No question, with more carbon in the air, it's going to warm up, it's going to tip the other way. But I think that's just a useful check to some of the assumption that like year by year, we're all going to fry and die, which is sort of the way it's reported. And that's reporting an underlying real thing, which is the harm of heat. But the reality is more complicated and more mixed and more slow moving. So I found that really interesting. And we've actually delved into the data ourselves. I've even been in the code of this data now. So that was one I wanted to talk about. And it feels pretty topical given the extraordinary heat wave we had in Europe, and obviously given last year's, BC coroner saying that over 500 people died from heat. The other thing I want to talk about was not so much something this summer, though it is changing this summer, but I was advocating we should talk about stuff that nobody ever wants to talk about. And so I'll talk about what I actually mostly do, which isn't energy, which is solar geoengineering or solar radiation modification, understanding the technology and policy of that. And I want to just say a couple things, and happy to take questions or take no questions and just talk energy. But this is a thing where I would say a decade ago, maybe even a few years ago, the general climate policy way to think about it was the way people thought about the smelly, drunk street person begging for food, and most people turn their eyes away and ignore it. And that's mostly how people treated this topic. Then to be clear, just to say for those of you who don't know, the idea is that one of the 4 big things we could do about climate, cut emissions, remove carbon, do solar geoengineering adaptation. Solar geoengineering is deliberately changing the Earth's reflectivity to reduce some of the climate change from CO2. And so I think that has been the attitude. And I think the attitude is changing a little bit to, it's a really risky thing, but it might work. And there are real measurable ways in which things have changed even in the last few months. We've had some heads of state talk about it. 4 ex-heads of state, including Kim Campbell from Canada, is dealing with this issue in a way that hasn't been dealt with before in a broader context. There's research programs starting in ways that are different. But I want to give you one factoid. We often talk about that, and it is true that there are risks, but I think there's actually a systematic overstatement of risks that may in fact be correct, but it's not what the science says. And in the end, if we're driven by science, we have to pay attention to it. You can't both believe the climate models about climate and not believe the same models about solar geoengineering. So let me give you a number. So we can estimate with models that are standard models what the deaths are from ozone loss and air quality from putting sulfuric acid in the air, and they're there. So for a 1 degree cooling, it's like 10,000 a year. The reduction in heat deaths is like over 1 million a year. So it's over 100 to 1. And these are standard. These are models that are hundreds of papers published, long-running models. And there are, every major climate model has been run, basically. And in scenarios where you use this to cool the world a little bit, mid-century, say 0.5 degree C, despite all our claims that it's very risky, you can't point to places in climate models where that's true. And I think what's happening now is people are, as it really gets hot, partly, or maybe as this information accumulates, are starting to say, why aren't we talking about this? So mostly we have decided not to talk about an energy versus climate, but it is actually mostly what I do. And it is kind of the skunk at the party that nobody wants to talk about. To be clear, it's not a thing that solves the problem. We have to cut emissions. But it actually objectively might be true that it would substantially reduce many of the risks we care about, and that a combination of cutting emissions and doing that would be a lot safer than just cutting emissions. And my view is simply that we ought to actually have the conversation, the policy, the science, and so on. So I thought I'd throw that out there because they couldn't stop me.
Sarah, what do you think? Should we question David? Questions of clarification? Do you want to talk about sort of what's keeping you up at night? Or David, can I just put one, maybe just a quick conversation with David on that? Is that okay?
I have a question for him too. So.
Okay. You go first with your question then.
Okay. So, you talked about the risks, David, and I think, tell me if these are the right way to think about the risks and what you think about those, right? But I really think of two categories of risks. So one is do we understand the science, the climate science well? And, if we put this stuff out there, is it going to behave more or less how we think it is? And is that going to then lead to impacts that, happen more or less how we think they do? And there, I'm hearing what you're saying is, probably just as well or better than the risk of not doing something if we have the warming. I think another piece of risk when it comes to talking about doing the solar geoengineering, and here I would argue that at least maybe there's a perception and maybe actually that risk has changed, but often people talked about the moral hazard, right, of having in-depth conversations about this, and this idea that if solar geoengineering was presented as a solution sort of too early in the climate conversation before we were, down the road of we're going to get to net zero, then it would be this shiny distraction over there for, various people that didn't want change to the status quo, and it might actually delay action in emissions reductions. Now, we can debate whether or not we're down that pathway. I mean, I like to think that that we are, if I'm being optimistic. Maybe in some ways we're really not quite yet, but I think we are in a qualitatively different place than we were even 5 years ago on that. So is that a fair way to think about the kind of risks? Are there other risks that I'm missing? And do you think that change in the moral hazard risk, for lack of a better word, is part of what's driving this increased interest, in addition to actually experiencing the heat waves and realizing that we're going to have to deal with this?
I don't know that there is a change in the moral hazard concern. There's a whole bunch of there's other risks you didn't mention: risks of using it offensively, risks of altering our relationship with nature. I've got a big taxonomy of risks, but I guess I'd say two things. One is, I think we're sort of persistently underplaying how much we really do know about the science. We had a really interesting meeting a month ago that brought together a lot of the people working on this the most, and it really is clear people are changing. I mean, and the fact is, we predicted the cooling from Pinatubo, a volcano in '92, before the cooling happened correctly. Those models correctly predict a whole bunch of observable things. We're talking about modifications that are small compared to the range we've seen from volcanoes. So I don't want to say it's all certain. It isn't. There's certainly room for unexpected things, but it's not like this thing we know nothing about. It really is a lot of what the models say. On moral hazard, I think moral hazard is not a reason not to move politically, any more than all sorts of comparators are. There were people who argued we shouldn't put airbags in cars. There were people who argued that we shouldn't do all sorts of risk-reducing things that in fact really reduced risks. And I think in the end, I don't think it's an ethical argument. I think it's a political fact that some parties that want to block emissions cuts, like big oil, will exploit knowledge about this to try and block emissions cuts. That's just natural. People act in their self-interest. But I don't think that's a reason not to do something if the evidence is that doing that thing reduces risk most for the most vulnerable.
So the question I have is around, I guess, the asymmetrical risk that is felt around the world. So mid-latitude equatorial states are the ones that are at the highest risk of heat-related deaths from warming. They're the hottest places to begin with. And they're probably the least likely to have that net benefit from staving off cooling that we're getting here in the north. Yet, when the decision to be made on this, I assume, will be made by rich Western states, that they're going to have to get together and they're going to have to say, yes, we want to do this, we're going to accept the risks, and we're fine with that, given the current power structure in the world. Stalin, and I think it's Stalin, said that One death is a tragedy. Sorry, bring it. Now we're going veering far left. One death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic. So how can we create that will to do something that still has unclear risk when the effects, the negative effects and the mortalities are happening disproportionately in another part of the world that people tend not to think about? Because you can have 10,000, you can have 100,000 heat deaths in South India. What gets the attention and what got the attention this summer was record heat in London and Paris. That's when we started caring about it.
So since we're doing this over beer and we're supposed to be having some fun, and you mentioned Stalin, I'm just going to riff a little bit. So, I mean, I'll riff on the extraordinary stuff that people know that's true, that's not true, on the nonsense out there. So how many of you have heard of chemtrails? Yeah, so I have a recording of a voicemail that I can play for some of you that my kids used to enjoy, that is somebody telling my voicemail that I'm really the worst human in the world, and specifically, numerically, that I am 10 million times worse than Hitler and Stalin, but it's not quite clear if it's combined. And my children always used to argue about whether or not I was 10 million times worse than just Hitler or Hitler and Stalin combined.
And telling you to do things that are morphologically impossible as well?
They were young for that, but they like that. I think we have no idea which countries dominate. I mean, the head of state that recently said this publicly was the Singaporean head of state that said we should do experiments and get moving. There is a fair amount of research effort in India, and I started my day, if I'm a little sleepy, I actually had to get up at 5:30 because one of the major, maybe the most important Indian think tank on climate ran a meeting on this that I was part of virtually this morning. And to be clear, this is so cheap that if India or Indonesia, another place where there is research on this, wanted to do it, they could do it. I think the way I think about it is if China and the US both want it, it happens. If they both don't want it, it doesn't happen. If they don't have a strong policy one way or the other, then it's unclear. And it may be that it's the rich world, but it may not be. And we're in a world of polycentric climate governance. It's not just states. And the role of NGOs here is powerful. So I think it's actually very hard to guess how the governance works.
I'm going to gratuitously pander to the audience and then move to Sarah. Is this a topic, as thorny as it is, that you would like to see us tackle in season 4? We feel like we've grown up. We purposely avoided it for the first 3 seasons. I'm seeing nodding heads. Yes. Moral hazard. You can join the pile on when we get to Q&A shortly as well. Okay, I think we should finally tackle it in season 4. Sarah.
All right. I have 2, random stories. I mean, one is really big, obviously. The news yesterday, the flip-flop out of the U.S. Senate, that it looks like that the clean energy bill will go ahead there. So not quite $400 billion U.S. in new spending for all kinds of clean tech stuff. The investment tax credit for solar that I think will never die. 15 years that people have been talking about the phase out of the ITC. And to be clear, obviously I think more money going into clean tech is a good thing, but it's interesting / slightly funny how it's a good example of how policy has this stickiness and status quo has this stickiness. And so the tax credit for solar and wind have been around for a while, and that may well no longer be the best way to support them, but it's sort of there already and it's easy to extend. So that was in there. There's all kinds of good stuff. I have to admit I did not read all 700 pages before tonight. I did find the one point that if you put a swimming pool in your backyard, you cannot claim the ITC for solar thermal storage. So anyone who was planning their swimming pool upgrade, not going to happen. But a lot of good stuff in there, right? So electric garbage trucks, electric school buses, all kinds of things.
But you're saying you're not actually a walking expert on Schumer, Manchin, and the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, by the way, for those of us long in the tooth. Isn't that a terrible acronym? I immediately thought of the Sex Pistols song. But So you're not an expert of it, but you think it's overall good. There's some good measures in there.
Yeah, the high level feedback is, it's good. I was actually, so this is taking me back, I cut my teeth in climate policy on the failed Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill back in the day. So I was an expert on that. I had read all however many hundreds of pages of that bill many times over. So it's a big deal, I think. This is something that the U.S. has been trying to do for more than a decade now, to pass a bill like this, and I think it will move the needle. There were some good wins for Canada in there. We had some of the tax credits for electric vehicles and some of the other technologies specified, higher levels for products that were made in North America. So not in the United States, but in North America, which I think is, probably was a big focus of the government here, and I think a big win for, our auto sector and battery manufacturing.
Interrupt for 1 second. First to say, I thought your point about stickiness of policy was right on and beautiful. But second, I think we should call for a poll. Because, of course, this hasn't passed yet. It will or will not pass in the next month or so. So hands up if you think it will not pass. Hands up if you think it will pass.
I think, David, clearly everyone read the Eurasia Group's analysis that came out at 4:04 p.m. today that gave it 75% odds of passing. So, that's why.
Over to you, Sarah.
Yes,
I had to do that.
That's why.
No, I think you're right. It has not passed yet. I heard people joking about, we need to seal the senators in some sort of bubbles for the next 5 days to keep them safe. And, never say never. So let's see what happens. But I don't think that there will be any snowballs brought onto the floor this time to kill the bill. So a little bit closer to home, the other thing that happened this summer was Alberta saw its second gigawatt, that sounds like less impressive than 2,000th megawatt, sign of corporate PPA sign for renewables in the province. So I think a bit of a milestone. Yeah.
And do you want to explain how you've had a hand in that milestone? Like, don't miss an opportunity for basically self-gratification. So, yeah, do tell. Or shall I tell it for you? Is it more comfortable?
You can tell it. I mean, I missed the opportunity for
I think
financial
you wanted to say
gratification.
self-promotion.
So,
self-promotion. Okay, well, self-gratification, promotion. It's
what kind of podcast are we hosting here?
Yeah. We won't go there. So, Sarah, and this is just, I remember 2017, 2016, 2017, had this great idea. I was still at Pembina, and she approached me and said, I want to bring the Business Renewables Center in the U.S., which is a very successful initiative that RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, had launched in the U.S. It was really this matchmaking service between developers of renewable energy and potential buyers of renewable energy in deregulated markets where you could buy virtual PPAs. I look at Marcus, and Marcus, you deal with this inside out. And I thought, that's crazy enough. That just might work. And I'm gone in 6 months, so yeah, have at it. Great. And so she did this, and you can really draw a straight line between this explosive growth and now deployment of renewables and using this financial mechanism of virtual PPA that Amazon and the tech companies and other oil and gas companies are fond of as a way of earning environmental performance credits or offsets, and the advent of Business Renewable Centre Canada, brought here by, first and foremost, Dr. Sarah Hastings-Simon.
Well, thanks, Ed. It was hard work by a lot of people, and I like to joke that the BRC, of course, part of what made it work is that it did not take a financial interest in any of these deals. So what I got out of this in the end is a paper that's currently under review that's going to talk about the direct line from actually the renewable energy policy that the government had, that the previous government had, which actually, we argue really contributed also to this growth by basically both providing price discovery and getting people to realize that renewables were a lot cheaper than they would have been, than people thought they were, right? But actually also filling the development pipeline. And so you had a lot of developers that came into Alberta and did early stage development of projects, which were the ones that were now picked up on these corporate PPAs after they didn't get a government PPA. And so great example of, good public policy at work.
That's right. Yeah. One anecdote, by the way, is Business Renewable Center in the U.S. had to rebrand. It had to rebrand to the Clean Energy Buyers Association because the word renewables was anathema to Republican Congress representatives and senators. you couldn't even use the word renewables because surely you must be one of those pinko commie liberals if you're coming in and asking for any kind of support.
We run with your points too much. You got more to say.
No, I mean, I think that's about it. There's a bunch of other good news stories, I think, too, right? I think the other one that I've been tracking lately is the electric vehicle registrations in Canada. So in Q1 of this year, we passed 5% for full battery EVs. So not even, if you add in plug-in hybrids, I think that bumps you up to something like 8 to 8.5%. But full battery EVs above 5%, which people like to talk about as that being a bit of a tipping point or a sign that you're really at the start of this exponential growth that, we keep saying is going to happen, might finally be happening. And it's it looks very different depending on which province you're in, right? So in BC, it's something more close to, I think, 15%. In Alberta, it's more like around 4%. But I find that even at 4%, I don't know how folks are experiencing that, but when I'm out, I find I'm often seeing EVs. That's the new game that we have is when I go out with my kids, whoever finds the first Tesla wins the prize. So that's, that used to be much harder to do than it is now. And I think that the next 5 years is likely to be a real, reckoning point there, right? And if you believe some of those projections, Bloomberg NEF is basically saying we've reached peak internal combustion engine vehicle, right? The fleet is as large as it's ever going to be. So, let's see how the next few years pan out. But I think we're going to start to experience that, I think, in a different way than we have before.
Okay, I want to turn the mic over to the audience very shortly here, but just one question for you, going back to Schumer Manchin. Do you think that someone from the Schumer camp discovered that Joe Manchin, did some very bad things in the 1980s while fueled on cocaine? Or did they just realize the political opportunity to basically hitch climate wagons to the topic du jour, which is anti-inflation measures? That's a leading question.
Maybe the latter. Maybe his grandkids convinced him not to be the climate villain. I don't know. It's kind of weird how this all hangs on the opinion of this one guy who owns a bunch of coal interests.
Well, I will cede my time on the floor, but I will say that in Canadian public policy, which is mostly what I deal with to do with climate and energy, these days, if you're not going in and talking about energy security and affordability and protecting Canadians from increasing energy prices, and then you talk about climate, you'll be laughed out of the room. And we're in the high season of consultation. Steve Bannon said basically you flood the zone with shit if you want to confuse people, while governments flood the zone with consultation in July and August to confuse people. We're in the high season of consultation, and we've been told by senior bureaucrats that basically you worship at the anti-inflation altar, and then you talk about your climate objectives, or you won't get through the door. And I think it's this tremendous, and we're seeing the erosion as a result, where unfortunately the capriciousness of public policy captured by the topic du jour, and right now it's protecting Canadians, and we're making bad choices on long-term climate protection in order to save Canadians and their pocketbooks. And I'd love for that to be different, but once again, we're held hostage by the politics of the day. And the IRA and the Inflation Reduction Act is, it's great that they attach so much to it, but they have to package it up as who's against anti-inflation, right?
Apparently 50 senators in the United States.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, like Planned Parenthood. So we do have a mic here. This is your opportunity. I need a volunteer. Joey, since you're putting your hand up, you get to ask the question, and then you get to be the mic rover.
Okay, I'll be the mic rover. Hello, everybody. My name's Joey O'Brien. Fellow Canmore like some of these guys. 3, if I may, quick ones. Boast.
2.
First, a boast. We created a green energy co-op in the Bow Valley that we wish to share throughout the province. By the end of this year, we will have installed in 12 months a megawatt with a green energy co-op. And our goal is to share it throughout the province. So ask me. Okay? I'd love to share our model, what we did, what we figured out, how we use community funding and investment from community members to cause this to happen. Here's an easy one. Now, I read this, but I don't know if it's true. During the heat dome in India, Pakistan, the beehives died. Do you guys know anything about this? I read just a little snippet about this, and then it went away, and I couldn't find anything more. That scares the hell out of me. If 50C is when the beehives die, that's a number. The third one I want you to pontificate about. When I look at the politics on the UCP and who's running and who's trying to get more and more extreme, and then federally Polyev and his crew and who's getting more left, or right, I'm sorry, it scares the hell out of me. I'd love you to pontificate about politics and what might happen in the next election cycles. Thank you.
I'll do the professor thing of answering a question I know that's not really about bees because I don't know anything about the bees. But I think there's a way in which people love sharp numbers even if they're not true. That's why people love the idea that there's a 1.5 C threshold, which of course is not true. So people really like reporting on the idea that there's a maximum temperature beyond which people die, and that's in science fiction books. One of our people, a friend of mine who we had on the show, Jeff Goodell, said that, or said a version of it. When you look at this mortality versus temperature data, you really don't see thresholds. You see different adaptation points. You see definitely deaths going up with temperature, but you don't see really sharp thresholds. And I don't know about the bee story, but I'm guessing it's not as sharp as it was reported.
Do we have an apiculturist in the house? An apiculturist? No? Okay. Well, we can't get a more granular answer on the bee question. For politics, so I'm deeply worried in that American culture wars were importing to Canada wholesale. And Alberta is often, I think, ground zero for that. So I look at the UCP race, and let's just say the more moderate candidates that are likely to be female former cabinet ministers coming from Calgary, I don't think will win. Now, I'm not a political expert. I could hope to be proven wrong, but I think we'll have someone who tacks further to the right, who hosted a very popular radio show and used that as a megaphone for a long time. And that will take our politics, including our climate politics, further to the right, in spite of what some of the more encouraging things that she said about Danielle Smith about net zero in last night's debate. And that is going to be a microcosm for what we're seeing in the Conservative race. I think we're going to see Pierre Poilievre first ballot victory, also in September. Now, I just filled out my ballot for my preferred candidates for the Conservative Party of Canada because I bought a membership to vote just because I think I'm voting on the next Prime Minister. I really do. And I know that maybe it might be different from the politics to some of the people. I really think it's a vote on the next Prime Minister. And it's not Pierre Poilievre. I voted for Jean Charest. But I think come 2025, we'll have Pierre Poilievre. It will be, in some ways, our version of Trump on a lot of things. People say that power will moderate. Power did not moderate Donald Trump. And I think we're seeing this tilt now to very populist politics. And unfortunately, a lot of those politics are fundamentally anti-long-term action on climate, and it's a bad outcome for climate. I hope to be proven wrong.
I mean, the other sort of thing that we might import from the U.S. on that file that worries me is looking at the coal story, right? And I mean, this is very much of a story with Donald Trump, too, right? The idea of bringing back coal and supporting coal workers was a big part of his campaign platform, right, and a big part of his plans. And so he took away, actually, a lot of the transition support that was available for coal communities and, tried very, pretty with a sharp stick, or I don't know what the right analogy is, but tried pretty directly to try to protect a bunch of coal plants in the U.S. and to prevent them from closing, both by trying to roll back some of the methane rules as well as trying to basically, get kind of standards put in place that would more or less, force coal plants to stay open, essentially. And the result was, it was unsuccessful, right? More coal plants closed, retired under President Trump than had, I think, ever before, or at least the pace, wasn't significantly slowed down. And that kind of, that kind of populist narrative around, I'm going to be on the side of the workers in this industry in the face of global trends that, can't be controlled, certainly not at the Alberta level, but not at the Canadian level as well, too, I think is one of the things that really worries me, where, it's both the people and climate are on the same side of this, and that if you're sort of pushing this idea that, we can just keep those workers in their jobs, and we don't have to make a change as long as Ottawa, leaves us alone and we can just do things the way that we want to, that leads to a bad outcome for everyone.
More questions, but not about bees.
Joey, would you mind? You asked the first question. Could you be the mic runner?
As long as you don't find somebody who talks about bees.
I dare you to ask about bees.
Yeah.
No,
Thank you.
Been there, done that. I'm Jan. I have a question that's more of a speculative engineering question, not a policy wonk question, so apologies if it's not your expertise, but I'll just kind of throw it out there just as a fun thing. And ultimately, it's an optimistic one because it's a really long-term one. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but with the exception of nuclear and geothermal and possibly tidal, every form of energy we have is ultimately solar or solar by proxy. So with that in mind, and with the fact that you guys did recently have a nice episode about how solar technology has become cost competitive with hydrocarbons, which is really nice to see. We have lots of sunshine in Alberta and lots of real estate, but in the long term, assuming that solar technology becomes kind of one of the main things in the energy mix, then one of the concerns becomes real estate. Where do we put these panels? So how feasible, or what are the main engineering constraints to ultimately having space-based solar panels and laser transmission of the energy down to the Earth? Obviously, cosmic rays, resilience against cosmic rays, and also maintenance would be difficult. Is that at all feasible as a speculative fiction premise, or is that a out to lunch question?
So I want to first push back on the premise a little bit. I mean, unlike wind, where I think there really is a footprint issue, solar, you can do all the world's energy. You can do like 30 terawatts on kind of a % or so of land surface. So that's not nothing. There will be environmental impacts of anything, but I feel like that's small enough that we can say there's not really that big a problem with terrestrial solar, if you put it in sensible places. There is more. I certainly talked with people in the space solar world for a long time. I took my name off the paper that would have been my highest cited paper because it didn't make a comparison. That was the Marty Hoffert paper about future transitions, because he talked about space solar and didn't. I said, you got to say what the costs are now. I said, there's a commercial market for space solar now, because there is for ComSats, and we know what they cost because ComSats want power. And I said, you got to put that number in. But it seems, I don't think you can rule it out because space technology is changing so fast. As much as Elon Musk is, as my friend Oliver Morton said, a prick, it is true that SpaceX is doing something amazing, and it's really a little hard to guess if that new thing really does drive down costs on order of magnitude. I think it changes things. I think we're mostly talking about microwave relays down. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's totally dismissible. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, two thoughts on that. So one, I think that future, right? The story that I always like is actually this comparison between solar PV and solar thermal, right? If you go back 2 decades or so, the two are really neck and neck as far as price. And now with the benefit of hindsight, we might say, well, it's obvious that solar PV was going to win out because it was more modular and it could piggyback on the silicon industry and so forth. And so that's, we should have seen that all along. But I don't think that there was no consensus, I think, at the time that was going to be the case. And so, when it comes to really future technologies, I think it can be very hard to pick, which one is going to work. So I'm hesitant to say, no way, no how, but certainly, I think David's point about the amount of space that's needed, there's a lot that we can do with what we have here. The other is that if you have kids, there's a very excellent book called Cat Astronauts that is all about that as a premise. So the cats have to save the world because the world runs out of power and they can't keep their fish cool. And so they go and make space solar. So good kids book on space-based solar.
I'm going to keep riffing in the sense that if we run on all solar, we either need spectacularly good batteries or half globe length electric power lines, which is actually potentially possible, or making solar fuels and moving the fuels. But you need one of those things, or you have space-based solar, and that does a different solution to that. And I think there's a lot of progress on robotic manufacture in space. All of it is very expensive now, but I think you could imagine that some of that just tips to be cheap, so that the capex cost of installing the panels I think you can imagine stories where it actually gets cheaper to do that in space than on the Earth in the half century.
Is there also a materials constraint in terms of mining the materials, or like the...
I doubt it, but in general, there aren't materials constraints.
And I would say, as exciting as space may be, and as a kid who grew up on Star Trek and Star Wars, I think there are good, old-fashioned, boring terrestrial solutions. I said, I've been out to Travis Solar in Vulcan County, and I was out there in May. If you know, Travis Solar is a 465 megawatt project, by an order of magnitude, Canada's largest solar project. I was there and I saw 500,000 panels of 1.3 million panels in total that will be built. 500,000 panels. So imagine that you look out and you see panels and rows of arrays as right out to the horizon, as far as the eye can see. And you think, this is a shockingly large area. Wow. But it's, in total, it's sort of 7 contiguous sections. Now, 7 contiguous sections in Vulcan County, that's a rounding error. That's a drop in the bucket. You've got masses of land. If that's how you want to purpose that land, you have all the land you could possibly need. It comes down to how you transmit that, and what we've talked about on energy versus climate in the past. I think interties between provinces like BC that have cheap hydro assets that could increase those assets, and thermal-dependent provinces like Alberta or Saskatchewan. And interties, unfortunately, is one of those issues that no cabinet minister wants to champion. And unfortunately, it's a very difficult one to champion. We put in those interties, and dare I say it, I don't think we'll ever have to go to space. All right, let's do a couple more questions. So we've got the... Oh, Marcus? How about Marcus, then green shirt? Sure.
Yeah. This is fantastic. Seeing you guys live is incredible, so thank you very much.
Bar tab on Marcus.
Absolutely. Hydrogen, and last week's announcement by the German government of contract for differences. I wonder what your take on this impact that it will have on the global hydrogen, low carbon intensity production, and not only in the European sense or perspective, but also how that will ultimately affect the pricing capacity for LCOH as we move along the global, taking into effect the IRA and a possible $4 per production tax credit for the hydrogen production, how this will affect Alberta. So global and then down to Alberta, how this contract for difference, this first government-backed contract for difference, will affect the energy production capacity or spectrum, and how that affects Alberta.
If I could weigh in first, so just quick definition, a carbon contract for difference is essentially the government saying we're going to underwrite, we're going to insure your project against fluctuations of the price in carbon, or more typically, it's used in electricity on the price of electricity. And Sarah can talk about research that she's done with Blake Schaefer around the renewable energy procurement round that the previous government did that had a CFD mechanism, and how the government has been massively in the black. Massively. The government's been making money on these strike prices rather than losing money. The taxpayer is making money rather than losing money. But yes, but they're mostly used in electricity, less used elsewhere. But the line in the emissions reduction plan for Canada that got released in late March, that got the most attention, was a passing line saying the government says we want to create some sort of insurance against essentially a future government coming in and mucking around with our carbon price increase schedule, so that you, big energy infrastructure company, can build your $1 billion or $1.5 billion decarbonization project and have assurance that the price of carbon is going to rise in an orderly way. And if it doesn't rise because Prime Minister Poilievre comes in and guts the federal carbon price, you've got these contracts that are hard to tear up, and you're insured that the price is going to be $170 by 2030 or something close to that. So it's a mechanism. I've chewed up all my airtime explaining the mechanism. All I'll say is it's a hot conversation in the government of Canada right now. But the government of Canada hates it, certain sectors, for two words, uncapped liability, because they don't know how much they'll be on the hook for. Now I turn to Sarah.
So when it comes to applying, contract for difference to hydrogen and sort of how that market starts, I mean, I guess this is a little bit of a crystal ball answer, right? Because nobody obviously really knows. But I think that, it's important, that first contract is important for, starting to build up global capacity. But I think it's really early to say that this is going to, I don't see it as really like, depending on who ends up getting that contract, whether it's something that's closer, that looks more like regional markets for hydrogen, or if it's something further away, where you're getting shipping. I think of that as more of a one-off or, some examples rather than necessarily being the start of the development of a market for hydrogen in this specific way, because, you have this moment of time now where you have, blue and green hydrogen, which are on sort of different cost curves. You have different concerns around, when it comes to Germany and the energy challenges they're facing, and the temporal component to, needing this energy soon also, that I think that, we could well see it go one way or the other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, a bunch of the rest of the hydrogen market will necessarily follow. And so I actually think there's still a lot of open questions, at least in my mind, about, is the hydrogen market going to develop to look more like the natural gas market or the oil market, right, in this very global market? Or is it actually, even if it starts that way, is it actually going to regionalize quite a bit? And, you end up with just these, hubs that we're producing hydrogen much closer to where things are used. And I find it very hard to know, which path we're going to go down.
Okay. We want to get back to the mixing and mingling. The weather's nice. The beer is plentiful. But I know we have one more. Yes. I know we have one more.
Okay, well, I'm happy to wrap it up. I'd like to bring it back to politics. I guess we can kind of come full circle. And I think, we're kind of already talking about this in concept with the carbon contracts for difference. But I guess I want to talk about, I call it usually policy durability, or I think David called it stickiness. And, I think we've had a lot of climate progress through the current federal government. And, we've had the carbon price on carbon, and I think we've got a really good thing cooking right now with the clean electricity standard that's under development. And, someday this government's going to change. So I guess what should we be doing right now as the clean electricity standard is developing to make sure that it's sticky? Because we might not have time to figure out how we did with the carbon price, where we're figuring out carbon contracts for difference. And then I guess, how much does it matter as we eventually transition governments that these policies are sticky as well? Thanks.
So I have two thoughts on that, right? One which is I'm always a bit torn because, of course, I personally want climate policies to be very sticky, but there is something somehow seemingly anti-democratic about tying the hands of future governments, right? I mean, in a sense, it's sort of, not really the way that things are supposed to work. And I think it's particularly challenging in this case where it's really, the risk I think that a lot of people are trying to insure against is not a future government that wants to act on climate in a different way and bring in different policies, but what do you do if you actually have a future government that doesn't want to act on climate? And so that moves us into this whole other, this sort of the philosophical part of the answer, but there's one part that's that. I think the other one is, looking at what happened with the change in government in Alberta and where there was, in some cases there was policy stickiness, like when it came to the coal phase out, and I think that came because of, the carrots that came along with that policy, such that the industry wasn't interested in, giving it back. It's not always a great plan to bribe people into the policy, but I think there is some lessons there. And then I think the other one is things like the renewable energy program, which transitioned into this corporate procurement, which is like, how do you use climate policies and carbon policies as really sort of make them look like industrial policies, so that you're actually sort of generating markets that can then become self-sustaining even when you remove those direct policy support. So those are the types of things that I would look for.
I mean, it's such a hard question. I think that, remember, climate's cumulative. Individual countries, individual governments matter less than you might think, because you're talking about cumulative emissions. I think the most important thing is we are in this intermediate period where climate is very visible and where a lot of money's being spent, but where a lot of money's being spent ineffectively and wastefully. and at least the way I see it happening is sometime in the next decade, there will be some reckoning where I don't think climate will go away, but we're going to shed some of the nonsense. And there is a fair amount of nonsense. And I think, to me, the best way to lead policies that are more durable is maybe false, but I'm going to hope that there's some rationality. And that if you have less policies that really cost $1,000 a ton carbon avoided and more policies that really cost more like 100, that in a world where you get a government that's less eager for action, you're more likely to have more of it stick.
Let's say the macro level. So Trump came in the United States, veered off the road in terms of any kind of progress on climate. In some ways, it didn't matter because you had California, Germany, and China continuing to have good policy supports and good market draw. And Canada, for that matter.
And the U.S. The point is the U.S. didn't change that much.
No. So you could look at it, and electricity, renewable electricity is a good case study because it is actually lightly supported by policy. It's got carbon value from regimes like TIER, or in other provinces, OBPS. But all they've done is just drive down the cost and make it super competitive with thermal generation. So that's a glass half full perspective. You reference the clean electricity standard, or as of Tuesday, the clean electricity regulation. I've been paying attention to it, and it is wholly dependent on the attitudes of a future government. Not only can a future government come up with one red pen and strike it out, they've also designed in this end-of-prescribed life provision for existing, we're getting wonky here, but for existing generation that would have a plan operating until the 2030s or even the late 2040s, not having to adhere to the clean electricity standard. So, forgive me, why fucking bother? When it's mostly existing generation you have to address. It's mind-boggling. And that is basically saying we're harnessing for these plants that are built before 2024, we're attaching their emissions performance to the policies of the day, whatever they may be. And I say, why fucking bother? Don't bother with a clean electricity standard. So sorry, that's my rant as of Tuesday.
Now we got to wrap up.
Yes. Okay.
Can I just hop in with 2 topic suggestions and also just a huge thanks. It's awesome to see you guys live. It's like a CD coming to life. This is like the band is here. You're together. It's great. So 2 quick suggestions. One is what we're kind of seeing around the decarbonization divide between urban and rural communities, especially off-grid rural communities. So I think I've listened to all the episodes, and I don't think there's been one on kind of rural electrification and so on. So that would be probably a pretty good one. The other one kind of flows perhaps from the States, where there's this great paper by a couple U.S. legal scholars called Old Green Laws Meet the Green New Deal. And it talks about how all these old green laws that were erected in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s kind of stand in the way of aggressive decarbonization. And we definitely have the same here in Canada. This is my own legal bent and bias, but I think an episode on that would be fantastic. And maybe a bonus episode brought to you by beer, about beer, with beer, and the carbon footprint and so on might be pretty good as a bonus.
And beer decarbonization. Yeah. Great. Okay, let's take one more minute. Any sort of popcorn style, just shout them out. Any suggestions you have for us? We're faithfully recording, so we will take this away as sage advice.
I'll leave you one. There's a transition required between all of the diesel engines that have been bought today, tomorrow, last week, next year, and the requirement of the construction company to run these things out to end of life, yet the challenge we have to electrify things. There's a topic.
10 assets more?
Cycling. Yes.
Cycling. Okay. But what specifically on cycling? E-bikes? Cost benefit? Okay. So rush order on that episode. Okay.
The full life cycle of whether bikes actually, what the emissions are because you're doing that extra work.
Actually, an e-bike is lower emissions unless you're like a vegan who really yeah.
They can't hear you. Can you start? Sure. Just you've touched on this before, but the pancaking of policy on policy on policy, oil and gas emissions cap, clean fuels, output based. There's all this stuff, and does it actually potentially undermine incentives?
Don't get me started. Yes, versus just going after everything with a really high carbon price.
Call it a day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Back to mixing and mingling. We really appreciate you coming out, and it's wonderful. We'll do it again. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.